Good evening, Life Chapel. Good evening, everybody that's here. Thank you guys for being here tonight. Everybody that's online, thank you for being with us on the live stream, on Facebook, on YouTube. This is going to be our third installment. I've got a cheerleader in the back. This is going to be our third installment of Can We Trust the Bible, also known as How Did We Get the Bible? Just to do a little bit of review, over the past few weeks, we've talked about what the Bible is and what the Bible isn't. The Bible, for us, we believe it's equally a human and divine project, obviously sovereignly given by God, but using the words of man. I was actually listening to a guy this week named Michael Heiser. Anybody heard of Michael Heiser in the house? Really great scholar, biblical scholar. He is really awesome. He's got a book called Supernatural that I would really highly encourage everyone to get. It tells the story of the Bible through I'm going to move back a little bit. I think I'm starting to ring. It tells the story of the Bible through the lens of sort of the heavenly realms. It's not a novel or anything. He does a lot of scholarly work on it, but he gets really in depth into what are angels, what are these beings, these supernatural beings. And so anyway, I would get that book, but he was saying, I was listening to a thing he was talking about, and he was talking about how the primary sovereign move of God was who he chose. So God chose men and that he could speak through to write his scriptures. And I thought that's a really good way to think about it. So we talked about what the Bible is, what the Bible isn't, and then we talked a little bit about the manuscript history of the Bible. And thank you for everyone who endured that, to put it in a word. Thank you to everyone who followed that with us. We talked about the manuscript history of the Bible. That was a lot of fun. How we got the Hebrew Old Testament, where we get the Greek manuscripts from, how many of them we have, all of that stuff, all that good stuff. So tonight, I think, even though it's going to be a lot of history, I think it's going to be very interesting if you have any sort of inclination toward this stuff at all, because it's going to be the history of the translation of the Bible. So going from the first church, the early church, the apostles who were sort of speaking the words and writing down the words, going from them all the way through to the Bibles that we have in our hands today. And so I think it's going to be interesting. One resource that I talked about during the first session, but I would highly encourage if you want more on this topic, is this book right here, Know How We Got Our Bible. It's by Ryan Reeves and Charles Hill. It's a short book. It's very story-driven, which you'll find. I heavily leaned on this as a resource for tonight's teaching, and you'll find that tonight is much more story-driven as well. And so I would highly encourage you to get that. It's just really interesting if you have any interest in history or the Bible or anything like that. So tonight we are talking about how did we get the Bible that we have today. I didn't bring my Bible up. I usually have it in my hand to kind of maybe as a security blanket or something, which if you're going to have a security blanket, the Bible is probably a good one to have. So tonight we're going to be talking about how we got our English Bible, right? So how it came from those Hebrew and Greek manuscripts that we talked about last week all the way through to the Bible that we hold in our hands tonight. And so there's sort of one thing I want to establish before we get into the timeline and we get into the stories of how this came to us. There's this notion out there that the Bible was kept from being translated for so long by the church, primarily by the Catholic Church, in order to keep people ignorant of what the Bible said. And there are particular times, one reign of one king or pope or one particular leader who may lean in that tyrannical direction, but by and large, the reason that the Bible wasn't translated was simply for a lack of resources and infrastructure on the church's part. It's the Bible. A Bible is thick. I mean, if you have your paper Bible here tonight, look at it. Look at how many words there are in there. In order to translate that, it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of money backing that translation. And so that's one thing that we don't think about. For someone to sit down and to translate the Bible, it's going to take. We're going to talk about a gentleman who spent 30 years translating, just translating. That's not printing, that's not sharing, just translating the Bible. That means he has to be sustained, food, resources, money. He has to be sustained by something or someone for 30 years. So to find backers for that mission is quite difficult. So while there were sort of short periods of time where there was a really tyrannical bishop or pope, and there were maybe, and when I say short period of time, I mean 100 years, a couple hundred years. By and large, it wasn't 2,000 years of the church, trying to keep people from reading the Bible in their own language. And so I just kind of want to put that out there at the very beginning. Secondly, in order to have a successful translation, one would not simply have to sway a single person like a pope. Now, this is also what we don't understand a lot, is you have to convince all of the other scholars that work in the field that your translation is a good translation. Otherwise, as soon as it comes out, all of the other scholars in the field are going to be like, this guy's trash, get it out of here, and they're not, So it's actually, it was much harder to get a Bible translation put out when you have to convince, a couple hundred bishops at times to everybody, look at my translation, this is good. So that's some things just to think about. So finally, I want to talk, just as a point of introduction, the story of the translation of the Bible follows very closely the men and groups who did the translating. And so we are going to very closely follow that story, not very closely, but we're going to follow through that story tonight. So quickly, here's the most linear way we can track how we got our Bible. I hope you can see that. I've been trying to make my slides bigger because on my computer they look great, and then I put them up here and you guys can't see them. But the early Christians, the church fathers, the living witnesses, all of those would be how we start. We get the collection, and like we talked about yesterday, I won't go back into how that was canonized, all of that. And then Jerome, a guy named Jerome, he translates it into what's called the Vulgate. Now, this was a completely Latin document, right? So at the time, Latin was still being spoken, although it was on its way out. It was sort of like, you could think of it as cursive for today, right? It's like, they've been teaching cursive for 100 years in schools, and now there's starting to be arguments of like, we should get rid of cursive. Kids don't need cursive anymore. Cursive, you could think of it like cursive. Latin was sort of the cursive of the day. It was the high script of the day, Latin was. So Jerome wrote his translation in Latin. Then in the 1300s, so you go from 300 to 1300, you have what's called the Wycliffe Bible. Then a guy named Erasmus in the 1500s, among sort of the turmoil of the Protestant Reformation, begins his translation of the Bible. He's a Catholic, though. He's an ardent Catholic. He's on the Catholic side of the Protestant Reformation. And then his student, his name's Tyndale. Tyndale's in the late 1500s, early 1600s. He was a student, actually, of Erasmus, and he's on the other side of the gambit. He's, heavy reformer, pushing that direction. And then in the 1600s, you get the King James Version, and then you come to us. So at a glance, you will see that there is sort of a huge gap between Jerome, who wrote the Latin Vulgate in the 300s, and then Wycliffe 1,000 years later. This is because Jerome was responsible for, like I said, the Latin Vulgate. The Latin Vulgate is and has been the official Bible of the Catholic Church from the 300s to today. Even today, the Latin Vulgate is the official Bible of the Catholic Church. And it has been, since Jerome did his first translation, it's been improved upon, but ever since he did that, it's a mainstay. So first, we're going to be talking about the story of Jerome of Stridon, or Saint Jerome. It's important to note that Bibles were being translated into other languages throughout that 1,000-year period, okay? Between Jerome and Wycliffe, there were Bibles and portions of books and whole books, and sometimes just the New Testament. Those were being translated within that 1,000-year period. Wycliffe did not create the first translation of the Bible, nor was he the first major Christian leader in history to talk about the need for the common person to be able to understand the Bible in their own language. And in fact, we think of the Vulgate as, the Latin Vulgate as inaccessible, But in its time, it was written as a, quote, vernacular translation. So even though it was written in Latin, it was written sort of in low Latin, understandable Latin for the common Latin speaker. It wasn't the high Latin that had sort of been on its way out, meaning that even for being written in Latin, it wasn't written in the high Latin of the scholars, but in the Latin of the Latin speakers that could read and write. But early on, as languages evolved, the church didn't have the infrastructure or the resources to oversee multiple translations, and over time, it did become something of a translation that was hard to be broken. It was hard to be replaced because, and this is a pattern that will emerge as we go on, tradition and translation kind of go together. And for those of you who grew up in a King James reading church, you'll know that. You know, it's like, well, this language doesn't feel like our language, but it's tradition. Tradition and translation go together. But before we get to Wycliffe, let's take a few moments and talk about Jerome and why he was so successful, why his translation of the Bible lasted for 1,000 years. So Jerome was born in 347 AD into a very wealthy and educated family. This is important to note. Jerome and most of the translators were not commoners. They were not people's people. They tended to be born in very wealthy families with high education levels and high status, and that's what gave them the ability to convince people to pay them to do this type of thing. He eventually moved from his home in northern Italy to Rome, and professional desire was his greatest inspiration in those early days. He is known as a very sort of dogged professional in whatever profession he chose throughout his life. But at some point, Jerome got sick to the point that his funeral was actually planned. He believed he was going to die, and in fact, 2 of his friends died from the same disease that he had. And this experience of being so close to death shook him. And after that, he dedicated himself to the study and prayer, and he actually initially tried to be a successful hermited monk. He decided, you know, I'm going to dedicate myself to the things of the Lord. I'm going to put myself away. I'm going to read and pray and study. And that didn't work out for him. So if you ever, you know, sort of try a new Bible reading plan or a prayer plan, and you don't get past the first couple weeks, just remember, the guy whose translation dominated the Christian church for 1,000 years couldn't make it at his first attempt. So that should give you a little bit of heart for whatever you're trying to do. He was well-versed in Greek to begin with, and he became one of the few Christian scholars of his day who could understand Hebrew. Now, this was during a time where anti-Semitic feelings began to charge the Western Christian church. So this is an important thing, and we can't get into it in detail tonight, but it does create quite the schism between Eastern and Western churches. Even today, there's an Eastern Orthodox church which has a completely different history from the Roman Catholic Church. And this is often because while Jews were often celebrated and accepted in the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church had quite a lot of anti-Semitism and wanted to distance themselves from the Jewish traditions. They felt like it was going to taint the good Christian gospel, which is ironic for people who had a Jewish savior. But the point being is that in the time of Jerome, it was sort of looked down upon to try and actually learn Hebrew. There was the Greek Septuagint, and that should have been enough. And so Hebrew scholars and teachers were hard to come by in his time because of that. So to even find someone to teach you, this is where his advantage of being born rich really comes into play. But he was a driven man, and so he found a converted Jew that would teach him in secret, because while anti-Semitism was strong, so was anti-Christianism, or whatever you would call that, within the Jewish community. And so this converted Jew taught him in secret so he didn't sort of get ousted from his own community. Now, he spent most of his career, or I guess I should say the early part of his career, sort of hunting heresies. So he defended the church against heretical beliefs like Arianism and I figured out how to say this word, pneumatomachianism. Yeah, pneumatomachianism, got it. And then Apollinarianism. So just a brief synopsis on some of these heresies. Basically, Arianism was the belief that, although now we think of like Nazis, like the Aryan race, it had nothing to do with that. It was this guy named Arius who came up with this idea. His belief was that God the Father was the only real God, and that although divine, Jesus was a created being like you or I. Although he believed he was higher than us and the angels, he was still a created being. So in order to say, no, like that's not true, Jesus is God, he is not apart from God, he went after that. But then pneumatomachianarianism, I believe, pneumatomachianism, anyway, that was basically like, okay, yeah, the Father and the Son are God, but the Holy Spirit isn't. And so there were sort of all of these different iterations of trying to figure out how God worked, how Jesus came to earth but was still God and was praying to the Father, but the Father was also God. So there's all of these situations. So he spends sort of the early days of his career pushing back against all of these heresies and encouraging people to believe that the Father, Son, and Spirit are in fact God. But then he would spend the latter 30 years of his life translating the Bible into Latin. This translation would be called, as we talked about, the Latin Vulgate. He was obsessed, he was absolutely obsessed with original languages, and he was the first actual major scholar to reject the Apocrypha from the Old Testament. So I know that's a lot of words, but if you'll go back in your minds and remember last week we talked about the Apocrypha, how the early Christians sort of got it wrong, slapped it in with the Old Testament, and then eventually Jerome comes along and he's the first main scholar who's like, no, actually Jews don't think this is part of the Old Testament. This is sort of a separate history. And so he encourages the Catholic Church to pull the Apocrypha out, which never actually ends up taking place. The Vulgate would then be the standard translation for 1,000 years. And this right here is a copy of a manuscript Vulgate. You can see it's this thick, right? And so it's got pictures, it's got, obviously the translation in it. So working on something like this by hand in the 300s, you can sort of get an idea of why another translation was going to be hard to figure out. Was going to be hard to fund. Again, being born rich was a really good thing for someone like Jerome, who had a very niche desire, right? So the Vulgate would be the standard, like I said, for 1,000 years. And then would come along Wycliffe, John Wycliffe. Wycliffe and his team would translate the Vulgate into English. So that was their goal. Now it's important to understand the translation trail that comes along. Jerome went back to, as we prefer, original manuscripts. John Wycliffe didn't have any original manuscripts to go back to, so he simply took the Latin Vulgate, which was translated from Greek and Hebrew. He took the Latin Vulgate and he translated that into English. So, a little bit about him. The Wycliffe Bible was scary enough that it was the first real challenger to the Latin Vulgate in 1,000 years. But the real problem was that Wycliffe was opposed to the Pope. This became a very difficult issue for him to overcome. During the time leading up to John Wycliffe's mission to interpret the Bible, the Catholic Church had gone through several reforms, most of which included centralizing more and more power around the Pope. So just so we kind of understand, because if you only have like a History Channel level understanding of like the Catholic Church and how we got the Pope and all of that, like it's very confusing, but it's actually not that confusing. It's very natural, it's very organic. So what happened is in the early days of Christianity, every area had a bishop, right? So when Paul was writing, you had bishops as early as that. Paul was writing to the church of Corinth, and he might write something to the bishop of Corinth, right? So in the very earliest days, you've got bishops, and these are sort of overseers of areas, like groups of churches, right? And so sometimes, from time to time, you'll hear someone be referred to as a bishop even today. And we've taken sort of that title and used it in the same way. What that means is generally sort of an older pastor who has moved into overseeing multiple pastors within an area. That's what a bishop was. So The Christian world thoroughly, though, by about the 300s, began to revolve around Rome. The city of Rome, it was like everything revolved around it. So it's kind of like you could think about maybe Columbus in Ohio. Everything sort of revolves around Columbus. Or you could think of maybe like Washington, D.C. or New York City. All the trends, all the fashion, all the cars, everything sort of comes out of these big cities. That's kind of what Rome was for Christianity. Everything just sort of naturally began to revolve around it. All the bishops wanted to get into Rome because that's where all the learning was, that's where all the manuscripts were, that's where all the resources were, and so everyone wanted to get to Rome. So the Bishop of Rome, specifically, again, bishops of every sort of area, the Bishop of Rome, though, sort of naturally became especially important because when there would be, say, disagreements among bishops, you said this, or you thought this, or, whatever, your translation, something would come up among bishops, they would go to Rome, because that was sort of the center of their world. And so then the Roman bishop, just because he was there, would sort of oversee that and be the weighing in party where he would sort of decide who wins this argument. But then everybody would vote. It was much more democratic in the beginning, but things kept being centralized on that Roman bishop. And eventually, this led to the Pope being formally named the head bishop. So over a couple hundred years of everybody just sort of naturally looking to the Rome guy, to like, well, what does the Rome guy say? Because he's like the most, like over a couple hundred years of that, it was like, okay, well, the Rome guy, how about the Rome guy's just in charge? Okay, how about he's just the head guy, and then we'll all sort of have our disputes in his presence. So he's the head bishop, and what this meant initially is that though the Pope was the final authority among bishops, right? He could have sort of veto power, if you will, to some degree. He was still answerable to scriptures. So ultimately, if there were a majority of bishops who were like, listen, Pope, listen, Roman bishop, you said this, but obviously it's in conflict with the scriptures, well, he could be overthrown, moved out. I mean, oftentimes, though, they were like killed, and it was a very violent history. We won't get into all of that. However, over time, in order for the Catholic Church to overcome some rogue royalty, because church and state are not separate, the church, if a king becomes Catholic, or if a certain state was like Catholicized, then they were essentially run by the Catholic Church. It was seen that your moral obligation was to rule your kingdom as the scriptures or as your Catholic Church told you to. And so what happened then is there were a few kings that, after the course of being like Catholic for several hundred years, there were a few monarchs or kings who were like, we don't want to do this anymore. And so what they did is they gave more power to the Pope. And they basically said that if the Pope says you have to do this or you can't do this, then that's the final word. And if you're in disagreement with the Pope, then that's going to be a problem for you. And eventually this gave him authority that is on par or even over the scriptures. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like we see this happening in lots of democratic governments, even in our own day. There's this idea that this one really powerful leader is going to sort of be our salvation. And so we keep heaping responsibility towards this one office that we would call the president. And over time, that one office has far too much power, and bad things begin to happen. So obviously, this led to some serious oversteps within the Pope's power. So going back to John Wycliffe, who's on the screen, John Wycliffe and his compatriots had a very bold and idealistic idea. They saw all this going on. They felt like it was wrong. They felt like, this shouldn't be. And so they believed that if the average person could understand the Bible in their own language, they would see how out of hand this had gotten, and then the people would rebel. You wouldn't need a central leader to lead a coup. The people would just stop, quote, being Catholic, if you will. Or their dream wasn't for them not to be Catholic, because Catholic was synonymous with Christian at the time. Their dream was simply for reform within the Catholic Church away from this Pope idea. And the truth is, he wasn't wrong. And this is why he and his Bible project were seen as precursors to the Protestant Reformation that would happen just a couple of hundred years after his life. So this rebellion that he sort of formed against the Catholic Church was what made the Wycliffe Bible stand out from the other English translations. As we've said, there were English translations, but Wycliffe said, yes, but my English translation is going to be the source of rebellion. And this is why it's so famous. This is why it stands out and is so important, because it was paired with a theological schism. The Wycliffe Bible was subsequently banned, right? So no one's allowed to read the Wycliffe Bible. And we to this day have no original manuscripts of the Wycliffe Bible, but we do know that it was simply a translation, like I said, of the Latin Vulgate and not of the original text. Wycliffe did not go back to earlier manuscripts, and so in truth, the value of Wycliffe's Bible and his English translation would have been limited, because again, it's a translation of a translation. But it was the precursor to things to come, nonetheless. So then we get to a man 100 years later named Erasmus. Everyone say Erasmus. Ooh, that was weak. Everyone say Erasmus. There we go. Erasmus. Erasmus worked in the early 1500s, and he was part of what historians call a humanist movement. Okay, so it's important to understand that humanism today is sort of synonymous with atheism, or believing that we as humans can sort of form our own moral code. This is not the humanism that we're talking about. It's a completely unrelated account of humanism. The humanists, you could think of them as classicists, people who loved the classics. There was this movement to reconnect their generation to the more ancient past of art and education. And because of this, Erasmus gave most of his focus to hunting down and translating the earliest possible copies of the New Testament. So that's what he spent his life doing as a humanist, is to reconnect sort of these ancient documents with his current generation. And he collected and worked to make available the entire New Testament in Greek, so the original language that the New Testament was written in, which was an amazing feat because he succeeded actually in that. He is known to have nearly single-handedly resurrected the study of Greek as part of biblical scholarship. So again, over the subsequent few hundred years, I mean, when the Latin Vulgate was translated, you already had sort of this distancing from ancient languages. By the time you get to Erasmus, it was almost just unheard of. It was almost a heresy in itself to say, actually, I would like to see an older document than the Vulgate, right? It was sort of like if you know, or if you grew up in a church, and I don't mean to harp on people, but people kind of joke about, like, if the King James was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, right? Like, you've got King James only people who are like, the King James is the original Bible, and it's like, well, there's, as we've seen, there's a few before that, but it's sort of like that. There was this feeling that the Vulgate should be good enough for everyone. You don't need anything more than the Vulgate. And so this desire to go and find the Hebrew and Greek manuscripts is really an unbelievable feat, especially within his Catholic upbringing and life. He didn't single-handedly resurrect the study of Greek. There were other people, obviously a part of the humanist movement, who were on board with him. Also, I'm sorry, but I just got distracted by this again. Does he not look like, I don't know if you online can see it, but does he not look like he just peed in the pool? Is that not the face you would make? I'm sorry, but I've spent so much time with these guys this week. I've stared at this picture for so long that I just keep thinking, like, what is that face that he's making? And he just peed in a pool. That's the face he's making. He also did a lot of work to preserve the writings of the early church fathers like Augustine and Justin Martyr and people like that, people who were writing even pre-Jerome. People who weren't necessarily part of the Bible, but who were very important for Christian history. This marked a turning point. It became expected that the biblical scholars would have an understanding for the original languages of the Bible rather than just studying the Latin. During the time of Erasmus, there was a lot going on. This is leading up to and during the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation was taking hold. Martin Luther was translating the New Testament into German. And while there were already German translations of the New Testament, sort of like Wycliffe, Luther's identity as a heretic made his translation sort of really important to the history of Protestantism. Erasmus, though, remained a devoted Catholic for the entirety of his life. and his career, but one of his students named William Tyndale, I call him Big Brain Boy, when I was just looking, because is that forehead reaching for the sky or what? Like, I've never seen so much forehead in one photo. But William Tyndale was a student of Erasmus, and he was quite a bit more sympathetic to the message of Luther and other reformers. And it was his goal to create an English translation, not from the Vulgate, like Wycliffe, but done from original manuscripts. It's important to remember that at this time, the crown and the Catholic Church were basically synonymous. So during this time, the King of England and the Catholic Church basically one and the same. Because of this, the Catholic Church was able to make it officially illegal to translate and distribute Bible translations other than the Vulgate. So Tyndale actually went on the run. His story actually is told briefly in this, but you can find sort of YouTube documentaries and things like that on William Tyndale, and his story is unbelievable because he's literally like a Bible convict. Like his whole life is just spent trying to get the Bible into English, and he's dodging sheriffs and he's running from Catholic Church officials. I mean, it's like a mystery novel. Within a handful of years, Tyndale was wrapping up his English translation of the Greek New Testament, and he had secured a publisher who would print the book for him under the table, because another thing to understand about during all this time is that publishers and the crown were, again, synonymous. The King of England and the government of England owned all the publishing companies. So you couldn't just go ask a publisher to print your book. So this particular publisher decided he would print for Tyndale, but under the table. But the night before printing was to begin, he was discovered by Catholic officials, and he had to flee into the night. And he had to leave all of his work behind. So every bit of work he found, all the manuscripts that he had worked up, all of the translating he had done, he had to run and leave all of it, but possibly not all of it. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but a good majority of it. He fled to a city called Worms in Germany. And there he began anew, but his work went much more quickly this time. And this is why some scholars believe he was at least able to grab, maybe a translation that he had done or a few books or something, because this time it sort of really, really snapped by. The Bibles were printed, and they began the smuggling process into England. So in England, after he gets his Bible smuggled into England, and he's got sort of this black market deal with Bibles. I mean, could you imagine? And this exists in countries around the world today, but could you imagine if you had to have a black market for the Bible? There were book burnings and condemnations, but the fire of Protestantism had grown out of control, and the Tyndale Bible was a key tool in the process, right? So it's like at this point, the Reformation and the move away from the Catholic Church had gone too far, and there was no more sort of reining it in. It's also important to note that the way Tyndale used English in his translation has caused him to be not only one of the most important people in biblical translating history, but also in the evolution of the English language. Because you have to understand that for hundreds and hundreds of years, people would learn to read, to write, to speak, would learn grammar, all just using the Bible, because it was a common book that everyone could use. And so the fact that he printed in English, right, the way he used English actually became the normal way of using English. There's a historian named David Daniel who claims that, and in his book is all about this, that without Tyndale, there would be no Shakespeare. And so that's interesting, but sort of obvious when you understand the importance of the Bible in this day. Eventually, though, under King Henry VIII, which many of you probably know from history class, or, some smutty movie, if you know, you know. He officially cuts ties with the Catholic Church. King Henry VIII is sort of known as a bad dude, killing wives, having, babies out of wedlock, just doing all of this stuff, and he eventually cuts ties with the Catholic Church completely. And there is then quite a long period of time for England within a tension, because again, the Catholic Church was synonymous with the government. So imagine if the president simply cut ties with the Constitution, I guess, or something like that, Then they go into this time of like, well, who do we trust? Like, who do we believe? Who are the authorities? Who's going to tell us how to live? And eventually they established what became the Anglican Church. Post-Reformation, we see two Protestant movements appear. Okay, so once we get out of the Reformation and things start to settle down, you've got the Puritans who were the who were the original reformers. These were the rebels. These were the guys who were like, we're not doing this junk anymore. Leave us alone. They're rogues. They're out there in the streets preaching. They're in the woods. They're like crazy people, right? Martin Luther and his compatriots were not normal people. You need to understand that about the reformers. They were absolutely wild men who were on a wild mission to separate themselves from what they viewed as corruption of the Catholic Church. Now, on the other hand, when King Henry VIII is like, you know what, actually, I'm not Catholic anymore, and we're going to start a new church, there's another, obviously, Protestant wing that comes into fruition. But this is a Protestant wing that hasn't had to fight for its existence. This is a Protestant wing who was backed by the King of England, right? So, is anybody a firstborn child in the house tonight? Any firstborn children? You, firstborn children, were the guinea pigs for your parents, right? When you were 17 years old, you were like fighting for your right to whatever, depending on how old you are, like have a cell phone or like stay out past 10, or something like that. And then by the time, if you have several brothers or sisters, by the time we get to kid 3 or 4, we're lucky if we know where they're at ever. I mean, they're just like, they got a cell phone at 8 years old, like they're walking around. They have guns. Like, why do they have guns? They don't have to fight for anything, right? They're backed by the king of the home, the king and queen of the home. Like, this is what the Anglican Church were. Like this, the Anglican Church were sort of the last born and the reformers. So they begin to like fight against each other because the Anglicans don't have as much of a chip on their shoulder. So they're like, well, we don't want to be Catholic anymore, but we want to keep some of the vestments. We want to keep some of the clothing. So to this day, Anglicans dress very much like bishops. We want to keep some of the traditions. We want to do some of the worship, and the Protestants were like, absolutely not. And the thing with the Protestants is even King James was annoyed with the Protestants, or the Puritans rather, because the Puritans, he felt they were very whiny. Everything was like a moral issue, like nothing was just, it's okay, but the reason they were like that is because many of their friends had been banished to exile or even executed for their beliefs. And so they're ready to fight for absolutely everything. So these two groups, it's important to understand, the Puritans and the Anglicans are nearly synonymous in actual doctrine. Once they left the Catholic Church, they believe almost the same thing. It's kind of like for us looking today like at Lutherans and Presbyterians, right? Like for any Pentecostal person, you're like, why don't you guys just be the same thing? You guys seem like the same thing to us, right? But there's differences right there, but that's very important to them. This was how the Puritans and the Anglicans were. And so they were at odds constantly over, more superfluous things like, what should priests wear? How should people dress? What should the worship service look like? So when King James I became King of England, this was sort of, again, a tumultuous time between Anglicans and Puritans. And James had no interest in reestablishing and maintaining a religious ruling class within England. Although there was the official English church, he wasn't like, the kings before him. He just didn't have an interest in trying to, squash out everybody else that wasn't Catholic. He was sort of like, this is the official church, but like, how can we all just live together? And that was his goal. His goal, it was very clearly to just stop hearing issues. He just didn't want to hear about it anymore. And so for all of the, people who talk about the influence of King James on the King James translation, it should be known he didn't really care. It's like there's like this evil king at the top of the thing that everybody's blown up in their minds, but the king just doesn't want to hear whiny people bicker back and forth all the time. Like that's all he's worried about. And so what he decides to do is to bring the two groups together is there's still not an official English translation of the Bible. right? There was the Tyndale Bible, there was undercover Bibles, there were New Testaments here and there, but there was not an official translation. And so what he says is, okay, Anglicans, Puritans, you're going to come together and you're going to translate the Bible, and we're going to have an official English translation. And that translation is what became the King James Bible, the KJV that we know today. And as standard as it is for us, the King James Bible has some peculiarities. These are noted by, again, Ryan Reeves and Charles Hill in the book Know How We Got Our Bibles. But it does have some weird things because of the way that it was translated. They include things like formal language choice. So, sorry, I forgot to switch my slides. So, formal language choice. So, most likely the King James was written the way it was to give it a sense of timelessness, to sort of give it a formality and a high way of speaking. But we sort of think everybody in the 1600s talked like the King James Bible, and that's simply not the case. In fact, comparisons between the King James Bible and the Tyndale Bible, which were written 100 years apart, the Tyndale Bible was written 100 years earlier, Tyndale will use words like stern, whereas the King James Bible will say the hinder parts of the ship. The Tyndale Bible will say, like, Jesus said unto them, and the KJV will say, and Jesus saith or spake unto them. So the King James, even for the 1600s standards, is very sort of, archaic and formal language. And another odd thing is that to keep things somewhat orderly and to try and put this Bible out within sort of one lifetime, because again, it's a lot to work on, the translators worked on teams in shifts. So you would go, say, your team would translate Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. And then another team would come in and translate verses 7 through 12. And then another team would come in. And so this is how they translated the Bible. So this became sort of, and they would probably translate more than that. But you get the point, is that one team would translate a little bit, then the next team would come in and just continue that work and continue translating. So this means that sometimes a word is a different translation of a word every time you come to it. So this is most apparent in the transliteration of names. So the name Judah, that we know now as Judah, in the original King James Bible, is sometimes translated as Judah, G-U-D-A-H, sometimes as Judah, G-U-D-A, sometimes as Judas, and then sometimes as Jude, for the same name, and sometimes even within the same story. And so you could be reading one story in the 1611 KJV, and they're talking about Judah, and then in the next few verses they're talking about Judah or Judas or Jude. And so you're like, things, sort of get confusing. And so this is also the committee, as we talked about last week, who transliterated God's name into Jehovah when it's much more likely Yahweh. They also injected things that they didn't know what a word was. So the word that we now know is like oxen. They put in a unicorn, literally. This isn't like, I'm not just poking fun. They didn't know what the word oxen was, and so they did all of the research that they could, and they just came up with unicorn. They also put like dragons into the Bible, where it's like Leviathan, which was sort of a chaos god creature within the ancient Near East, but they would be like the dragon, and so they sort of injected a lot of different things. Now, that's not to say that this should be thrown out. And if you have sort of a golden tablets view of the Bible, again, like we talked about in the first and second week, the golden tablets view that everything was dictated from the mouth of God, and if any comma, any word changes or is wrong slightly, the whole thing is worth throwing out. If you have that view of the Bible, then the King James translation, or any translation that we've talked about thus far, is going to be very problematic for you. But what we believe is that God is in the process of the translation, and that the translation process is like everything we do when we're in partnership with God. It's Israel. It's a wrestling match with God. It's trying to figure out, how can we best say this? How can we best communicate with you? How can we move this? And it's important to note that aside from one minor thing, again, there are no theological problems with the 1611 KJV. So you're not going to walk away thinking, that Jesus was Buddha, or some weird thing. All of the major theological themes are the same. It's just sometimes there are unicorns, right? And I say one minor thing. The original translation, for whatever reason, when Abraham was tested, the original translation said, and God tempted Abraham. But we know from later in the Bible that God is not the tempter of man. And so they used that word tempted that probably should have been tested, was changed later on. So that's maybe one theological issue. But outside of that, again, Jesus is Jesus, God is God. We're working with all the same parts and pieces here. So this, though, the KJV was definitely not the most problematic translation, obviously. As people began to move from England to the Americas and to the New World, for the first time in centuries, there were no restrictions on printing. Anyone who could afford a printing press was able to print the Bible. So for context, during the time that the pilgrims are coming over and the nation is being founded, there was only one family printing press in England that was allowed to print the Bible. They were the only one that was allowed. And for 200 years, they were the only one who printed the Bible. I didn't write their name down, but now everybody moves to the New World, and it's like if you can afford a printing press, you can print whatever you want. And so what happened is as denominations begin to split off and the Quakers are formed and all of these other different things, people began to translate the Bible for their denomination, to give their denomination a language. And some of them simply take the King James Version and sort of put it in their own words. Some of them go back to the Latin Vulgate. Some of them do what they can do. But a lot of these were actually very problematic. But most Christians, even throughout that time, inspired by fundamentalist pastors, continued to use the KJV. And even to this day, 50% of people who read the Bible on a daily basis use the KJV as their Bible. So this fundamentalist thing of we should use the KJV was actually a blessing because it meant that churches could be connected interdenominationally by the language of the Bible. But it also had its downsides because scholars had long known about some of the KJV's idiosyncrasies. And though there were updates to remove things like unicorns and things of that nature, many felt that there could be a better translation from the start. So there were many scholars that if we could just start over and do our own, I think we could do a better job. And so most recently, by the mid-1900s, some translations created by special Bible councils began to convince people that new translations are not inherently evil. And today we have translations that are very trusted and used widely, like the ESV. And actually the NIV is the best-selling Bible of the day. So with that, thank you for hanging with me. That's the talk for tonight. That's it. You guys made it through. Welcome to the end. Next week, we're going to be talking about, next week, I promise you, will be much more interesting because we're going to be talking about current translations that are on the market today, what the differences are between them, which ones you should read, which ones, some that are just sort of neutral, they're maybe people misunderstand them, but then some of them might be actually poor translations in general. So next week we're going to be talking about that, and then finally within that sort of same talk, we're going to be talking about at Life Chapel how we view the Bible, use the Bible, and trust the Bible as our foundation as a church. So with that, thank you to everyone online, and we will see